Imagine uncovering the biggest betrayal of your life, not from a stranger, but from the person you trusted the most. What would you do if your husband's retirement ceremony, a day meant for celebration, turned into a shocking exposé of lies, deceit, and danger? Stay with us, because what began as a quiet family secret spiraled into a nightmare no one could have predicted. This is the story you won't believe, and the truth you can't ignore. The grand banquet hall buzzed with excitement as guests gathered to celebrate John Harrison's retirement. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee and the soft scent of floral arrangements that lined the tables. John, a man in his 60s, stood near the podium, smiling graciously as people came up to shake his hand. He was the man of the hour, respected, admired, and seemingly loved by all. His wife, Sarah, stood proudly by his side, radiating warmth. Their 2 grown children mingled with the guests, laughing and sharing stories about their father's dedication to work and family. The ceremony began with speeches. One by one, John's colleagues shared heartfelt anecdotes about his years of service. Laughter echoed through the room as they recounted his quirks, and applause followed every joke and story. John stood quietly, absorbing the praise, but there was a hint of tension in his eyes. He kept glancing at the entrance, as though expecting someone. Sarah noticed his distraction, but dismissed it as nerves. It was, after all, a big day for him. As John's youngest son stepped onto the stage to give a heartfelt toast, the doors of the hall opened with a creak. Heads turned as a woman in her late 40s walked in, her posture straight, her eyes scanning the crowd. She was followed by 2 teenagers who stayed close to her. They moved deliberately, as though they knew they were stepping into forbidden territory. The room hushed, and for a moment the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Sarah's warm smile faltered as she noticed John's hand tighten around the glass he was holding. The woman stopped in the middle of the hall, her gaze fixed on John. "Congratulations, John," she said, her voice steady but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Or should I say, Dad?" The word hung in the air like an accusation, silencing every whisper. Sarah's face froze, her eyes darting from the woman to John, whose expression had turned pale. The teenagers stood awkwardly, avoiding eye contact with the guests, but glancing nervously at the man they called their father. It wasn't just the words that stunned the crowd, it was the certainty in her tone. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a statement, and its implications sent ripples of shock through the room. The silence in the hall stretched unbearably as Sarah's breathing grew shallow. She turned to John, her voice barely a whisper. "What is she talking about, John?" He didn't answer. His lips moved, but no words came out. The woman, undeterred by the tension, stepped forward. "I'm Emily," she said, her eyes narrowing. "We've been waiting for years for you to acknowledge us. I wasn't going to let this moment pass without the truth coming out." John's eldest daughter, sitting in the front row, stood abruptly. "What the hell is going on?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Sarah stumbled back, her hand gripping the edge of the table for support. The other guests, unsure whether to leave or stay, exchanged uncomfortable glances. A murmur began to spread through the crowd like wildfire, each guest piecing together fragments of what they'd just heard. "Stop this," John finally managed to say, his voice low but firm. He turned to Emily, his expression a mix of anger and desperation. "Not here, not like this." But Emily refused to back down. "And when, John?" she snapped. "You've hidden us for years. I've kept quiet for so long, but no more. My kids deserve to know why you've treated them like a dirty secret." Sarah's face twisted with confusion and betrayal. "Is this true?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Is she telling the truth?" John didn't answer. The silence was deafening, and in that moment, Sarah knew. Tears welled in her eyes, but they didn't fall. Instead, her expression hardened. "How could you?" she whispered, each word laced with pain. Emily took a step closer to the podium, her children following hesitantly. "He made promises to me," she said, addressing the crowd as much as John. "When he moved here, he told me it was for work. He said it would only be temporary, but then he started another life, with you." She pointed at Sarah, who flinched as though she'd been struck. One of the teenagers spoke for the first time. "We didn't want to come," he said, his voice quiet. "But Mom thought we should. We wanted you to know." The boy's words hit John like a hammer. His shoulders sagged, and his gaze fell to the floor. The image of the perfect man, the devoted husband and father, crumbled before everyone's eyes. Sarah, regaining some composure, straightened and faced Emily. "And you?" she asked coldly. "You knew about me and stayed with him anyway?" Emily hesitated, her defiance wavering. "I believed him," she admitted. "I believed every lie he told me, just like you did." The weight of the betrayal hung heavy in the room. Sarah turned to John, her voice now a mixture of fury and heartbreak. "You've destroyed everything," she said. "Everything we built, everything we were." The guests, unable to bear the tension any longer, began to shuffle out of the hall, leaving the family in their fractured chaos. John's youngest daughter stayed rooted in place, her hands clenched into fists. "Is there more?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Or is this it? Are there more families we don't know about?" John's silence spoke louder than any words he could have offered. Emily, sensing that her work was done, turned to leave with her children. "I'm sorry for ruining your day," she said, though there was little sincerity in her tone. But it was time. As they walked out, Sarah felt her world collapse entirely, the weight of the betrayal threatening to crush her. Little did they know, this was only the beginning of a nightmare far darker than anyone could have imagined. The ride home was suffocating. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. Her face was a mask of shock and rage, while John gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. Their children sat in the back, silent, their earlier demands for answers left unspoken. The air inside the car felt heavier than the storm brewing outside. When they reached their house, Sarah got out without a word. She didn't wait for John or their children. She marched straight inside, slamming the door behind her. John lingered by the car, staring at the ground as though it might provide him with an escape from the reality he had created. Inside, Sarah paced the living room, her mind racing. Every happy memory, every cherished moment from their decades together, now felt tainted, rewritten by his betrayal. "How long?" she finally demanded when John walked in, his shoulders slumped like a scolded child. "How long have you been living this lie?" John sighed heavily, sinking into a chair. "It started before we moved here," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I met Emily when I was working in Richmond. It wasn't supposed to last." "That's all you have to say?" Sarah spat. Her voice cracked, tears streaming down her face. "You lied to me, to all of us. You let us believe you were this devoted husband and father, and all the while you were living some twisted double life." Their eldest daughter stepped forward, her face twisted in anger. "Did you even love us?" she demanded. "Or were we just another part of your performance?" John looked up, pain etched into his face. "Of course I loved you," he said. "I still do." "Don't," Sarah interrupted, her voice ice cold. "Don't you dare say you love us. Love doesn't look like this." The conversation spiraled into chaos. Sarah hurled accusations, her words sharper than knives, while their children alternated between shouting and crying. John's attempts to defend himself fell flat, his explanations sounding hollow. It was clear that nothing he said could fix what he had broken. While Sarah and her children grappled with their devastation, Emily and her children were navigating their own storm. They had returned to their modest home on the outskirts of town, far removed from the grandeur of the Harrison household. Emily's teenage son, Ryan, was fuming. "Why did we have to go?" he snapped. "What was the point of humiliating us like that?" Emily sat at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. "You don't understand," she said softly. "He needed to be held accountable. He couldn't keep living this lie." "But what about us?" Ryan shot back. "Now everyone knows we're the second family. Do you think that's going to make our lives better?" Before Emily could respond, there was a knock at the door. It was soft but persistent, cutting through the tension in the room. She froze, her heart pounding. It was late, too late for visitors. The kids exchanged nervous glances as Emily stood and approached the door cautiously. When she opened it, no one was there. The porch was empty, but a folded piece of paper sat on the doormat. Emily picked it up, her hands trembling. She unfolded it to reveal a short, typed message. "Stay quiet, or you'll regret it." Her blood ran cold. She stepped outside, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing. Whoever had left the note was long gone. She closed the door quickly, locking it behind her. "What is it, Mom?" Ryan asked, noticing the fear in her eyes. "Nothing," Emily lied, tucking the note into her pocket. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. It was a warning, and Emily knew exactly who it was meant for. She had exposed John's lies, but she had also unearthed something darker, something she hadn't anticipated. A part of her wanted to believe the note was an empty threat, but deep down she knew better. Secrets like John's didn't stay buried without consequences. Back at the Harrison home, Sarah was pacing the living room late into the night. She couldn't sleep, couldn't think clearly. Her phone buzzed on the table, startling her. She picked it up to see an unknown number flashing on the screen. She hesitated before answering. "Hello?" she said, her voice shaky. A deep, distorted voice came through the line. "You don't know the half of it," the caller said before the line went dead. Sarah's heart raced. She stared at the phone, her mind spinning. What else could there possibly be? What was it that she didn't know? And more importantly, who was watching her family now? The morning light crept into Sarah's bedroom, but it brought no comfort. She hadn't slept, her mind trapped in a storm of confusion and fear. The voice from the phone call echoed in her head. "You don't know the half of it." What did it mean, and why had it sounded like a threat? She clutched her phone tightly, debating whether to call the police, but something held her back, a gnawing instinct that the truth wasn't ready to reveal itself. Downstairs, the house was eerily quiet. John had left early, leaving a terse note on the kitchen counter. "I'll be back later." "I need time to think." Sarah crumpled the paper in her fist, her anger bubbling to the surface again. Time to think? How much more time did he need after years of lying? Her eldest daughter, Emma, appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "Mum, I think you should see this," she said hesitantly. Sarah followed her into the living room, where her son, Jake, was staring at the television with wide eyes. The local news anchor's voice filled the room. "Breaking news this morning. A prominent figure in our community, John Harrison, is now the subject of public speculation following allegations of maintaining a second family. The shocking revelation came during his retirement ceremony last night. Sources close to the family describe growing tensions." Sarah sank onto the couch, her hands shaking. Her private humiliation had become public. Her neighbors, friends, and even strangers now knew about the cracks in her perfect life. She reached for the remote to turn it off, but Emma stopped her. "There's more," Emma whispered. The anchor continued, her tone shifting to something darker. "In an unrelated development, local police have confirmed that a suspicious note was found near the Harrison residence last night. Authorities are investigating the possibility of threats linked to the recent controversy. Sarah's breath caught. "How do they know about the note?" she asked aloud, though no one had the answer. Her mind raced as she pieced together the details. The call, the note Emily received, the rising tension. It wasn't just her family in danger. Whatever John had been hiding, it was bigger than infidelity, and it wasn't over yet. Emma's phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the silence. She glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's Dad," she said, holding the phone up for Sarah to see. "He wants to meet at the church." Sarah hesitated, fear and curiosity battling within her. "Why the church?" she asked. Emma shrugged, just as confused. The thought of seeing John again churned Sarah's stomach, but she needed answers. If this meeting could shed light on what was happening, she couldn't afford to stay in the dark. "Let's go," Sarah said firmly, grabbing her coat. She wasn't ready to forgive him, but she was ready for the truth, no matter how ugly it turned out to be. The drive to the church was silent, each mile steeped in tension. Sarah clutched the steering wheel tightly, her mind racing with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Emma sat beside her, scrolling through her phone, while Jake sat in the back, fidgeting nervously. The church, a place Sarah had always associated with peace and stability, now loomed ahead like a foreboding shadow. They parked in the gravel lot, the crunch of the tires breaking the silence. John's car was already there, parked awkwardly near the steps. The church doors were slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Sarah exchanged a glance with her children, a silent acknowledgement of their unease, before pushing the door open fully. Inside, the church was cold and eerily quiet. Stained glass windows cast fragmented light onto the pews, but the usual warmth of the space felt absent. John stood near the altar, his hands clasped in front of him. He looked older, smaller, as though the weight of the last 24 hours had drained the life out of him. "You came," he said, his voice low and strained. His eyes flickered to Emma and Jake, and he hesitated. "I need to talk to your mother alone." "No," Sarah said sharply, her voice cutting through the stillness. "Whatever you have to say, you'll say it in front of them. They deserve to hear the truth, too." John nodded reluctantly, his gaze falling to the floor. "There's more to this than what you know," he began, his voice trembling. "Emily, her showing up wasn't just about the family. She's been threatening me for months. She found out things I thought I'd buried a long time ago." "What things?" Sarah demanded, stepping closer. "What could be worse than what we already know?" John took a deep breath, his hands shaking. "It's about my work," he said. "Years ago, when I was starting out, I got involved in something illegal. Emily knew about it, but she kept quiet. Until now. She found evidence, things that could ruin me completely. She said if I didn't acknowledge her and the kids, she'd expose everything." "Illegal?" Jake blurted out. "What are you talking about, Dad?" John's voice broke. "It was financial fraud. I helped funnel money through a company to avoid taxes. It was stupid, reckless, and I thought it was over. But Emily found proof, emails, documents. She wanted justice, and I didn't know how to stop her." Sarah stared at him, her face a mask of disbelief. "So you thought keeping two families wasn't enough," she said bitterly. "You had to add fraud into the mix." John didn't respond, his guilt evident. Emma folded her arms, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Great, so now we're the kids of a cheating husband and a criminal. What else, Dad? What else don't we know?" John opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the church doors slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. Everyone turned sharply, their breaths catching. A figure stepped out of the shadows, their face obscured by a hood. The air in the church grew colder, heavier. "You think confessing makes it better?" the figure said, their voice low and menacing. "You don't get to walk away from this." John froze, his face draining of color. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure stepped closer, and as the light hit their face, Sarah's stomach dropped. She didn't recognize them, but the fury in their eyes made it clear this wasn't over. "Your secrets don't just destroy lives," the figure said, their voice trembling with anger. "They cost people everything, and now it's your turn to pay." Before anyone could react, the figure raised an object in their hand, the glint of a knife catching the light. Time seemed to freeze as the knife gleamed in the dim light of the church. Sarah instinctively stepped in front of her children, her arms outstretched protectively. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the panic surging through her veins. The figure's eyes locked on John. "I want justice," they hissed. "You've ruined lives, stolen futures, and walked away like it didn't matter. Not anymore." John stumbled backward, his legs hitting the edge of the altar. "I don't know you," he stammered. "Whatever you think I did." "Don't lie," the figure snapped, their voice echoing through the cavernous space. "You think you're untouchable because of your money and connections, but people like you always pay eventually." "Please," Sarah said, trying to calm the situation. "Let's talk about this. Whatever John did, we'll make it right. You don't have to do this." The figure's hand trembled, the knife wavering for a moment. For a brief second, Sarah thought her words had reached them, but then the figure's gaze hardened again. "Talking won't fix what he's done," they said. "He has to feel what it's like to lose everything." The tension shattered as Emma stepped forward. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice cracking with anger. "You think you're the only one who's been hurt by him? You think we haven't lost everything too? He's destroyed our lives just as much as yours." The figure hesitated, their knife lowering slightly. "Your lives?" they asked, their tone skeptical. "You're his family. You've benefited from everything he's stolen." Emma's face flushed red. "Do you think this is benefiting?" she yelled, gesturing wildly around her. "Finding out your dad's a liar and a cheat? Watching your mom's heart break? We're just collateral damage in his mess. But killing him, that doesn't fix anything. It just makes you like him." The room fell silent again, the weight of Emma's words hanging in the air. The figure's breathing grew uneven, their hands still trembling. John, pale and sweating, finally found his voice. "I'll turn myself in," he said suddenly. "Whatever you think I've done, I'll admit to it. Just don't hurt my family." The figure scoffed. "You think your confession erases everything." They stepped closer to John, who flinched visibly. But before the knife could strike, Jake grabbed a heavy candlestick from the altar and hurled it toward the figure. It struck their arm with a dull thud, and the knife clattered to the ground. "Run!" Sarah screamed, grabbing Emma and Jake as the figure doubled over, clutching their arm. The family bolted toward the doors, their footsteps echoing loudly in the empty church. John hesitated, his eyes darting between the figure and his fleeing family. "John, move!" Sarah shouted from the doorway, but before John could run, the figure lunged, tackling him to the ground. A struggle ensued, John's desperate cries mixing with the sound of fists hitting flesh. Sarah froze, torn between her instinct to protect her children and her lingering sense of responsibility for the man she had once loved. "Mom, we have to go," Emma cried, pulling at her arm. Sarah hesitated for a heartbeat longer before rushing back into the church. She grabbed a heavy hymn book from a nearby pew and swung it at the figure with all her strength. It connected with a sickening thud, and the figure crumpled to the ground, unconscious. John lay gasping for breath, blood trickling from his lip. Sarah stood over him, trembling, the hymn book still in her hands. "Get up," she snapped, her voice filled with cold fury. "We're leaving, now!" John staggered to his feet, and together they ran out of the church, leaving the figure motionless on the floor. The family piled into the car, the engine roaring to life as Sarah floored the gas. No one spoke, their breaths heavy, their minds racing. In the rearview mirror, Sarah caught one last glimpse of the church, its doors swinging in the wind. Something told her that this wasn't the end. Whoever that figure was, they weren't acting alone, and the darkness surrounding John's secrets wasn't done consuming them yet. The drive home was filled with a suffocating silence, broken only by the sound of Emma and Jake's unsteady breathing. John sat slumped in the passenger seat, his head tilted back, blood seeping from a cut on his cheek. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white, her mind racing through the chaos they had just escaped. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Sarah turned off the engine but didn't move. "Inside," she said quietly, her voice firm but brittle. "All of you. Now." Emma and Jake scrambled out of the car without hesitation, darting inside as though the walls of the house might somehow protect them. Sarah waited a moment before turning to John. "You're going to tell me everything," she said coldly. "No more lies, no more excuses." John nodded weakly, his hands trembling. He opened the car door but staggered slightly as he got out. Sarah steadied him, not out of compassion, but because she needed him alive long enough to explain. They entered the house together, closing and locking the door behind them. The kitchen felt impossibly small as the four of them gathered around the table. Emma and Jake sat rigidly, their faces pale and drawn, while Sarah leaned against the counter, arms crossed. John sat down heavily, rubbing his hands over his face as if he could scrub away the guilt etched into his features. "Start talking," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. John took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging. "The man at the church," he began. "I don't know his name, but I know who he is. He's connected to the fraud I was involved in years ago." Jake sat forward, his brow furrowed. "What fraud? What did you do?" John hesitated before continuing. "When I was younger, I got caught up in a scheme. It started small, hiding money to save on taxes, but it grew. The company I worked for laundered millions, and I helped them cover it up. When the authorities started closing in, I got scared and left. I moved here, started over." "And you thought you could just run away?" Emma spat, her eyes blazing. "You thought you could lie to everyone and pretend it never happened." "I didn't think they'd find me," John said, his voice breaking. "But they did. That man. He's been following me for weeks. Emily must have tipped him off. She had proof, emails, documents. She must have sent them to him." Sarah's stomach churned. "So this isn't just about your affair," she said. "You've dragged us into something dangerous. Do you realize what you've done?" "I was trying to protect you," John insisted. "I didn't want you or the kids to get hurt." "Hurt?" Sarah's voice rose, her fury boiling over. "That man was ready to kill you in a church. Do you think that's protecting us?" Jake slammed his fist on the table, startling everyone. "So what now?" he demanded. "What happens when this guy comes back? What if there are more of them?" John shook his head. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I need to find out. I'll go to the police." "No," Sarah interrupted sharply. "You don't get to make that decision. You've lied enough. We're not going to the police until we know exactly what we're dealing with." Emma's phone buzzed on the table, breaking the tense silence. She glanced at the screen and paled. "Mom," she said quietly, turning the phone to face Sarah. A text message glowed on the screen from an unknown number. "You can run, but you can't hide. This isn't over." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as the realization set in. They weren't safe. Not here, not anywhere. Whatever John had run from was catching up to them, and it wasn't going to stop until it destroyed everything in its path. The weight of the message on Emma's phone hung over the room like a dark cloud. Sarah stared at the glowing screen, her breath shallow and uneven. The words felt like a death sentence. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop, and they had made it clear they were watching. Every window, every shadow outside the house now felt like a threat. John shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We need to leave," he said, his voice cracking. "If they know where we are, we're sitting ducks. We have to go somewhere they can't find us." Sarah snapped her head toward him, her eyes blazing with anger. "You don't get to decide what we do," she said coldly. "You put us in this mess. You lied, you cheated, and you dragged us into something dangerous. You don't get to be the one who calls the shots now." John recoiled slightly, but he didn't argue. Emma and Jake looked between their parents, the fear in their eyes replaced with a flicker of anger. "So, what do we do then?" Jake asked. "We can't just sit here waiting for them to show up." Sarah exhaled deeply, trying to steady herself. "We need answers," she said. "If this man is tied to your fraud, then we need to figure out what he wants. Is it money? Revenge? What is he after, John?" John hesitated, his face pale. "It could be both," he admitted. "When I left, I thought I was in the clear, but I know there were loose ends. The company I worked for lost millions when the scheme collapsed. People went to prison, but I didn't, because I ran. They probably think I owe them." Emma leaned forward, her jaw tight. "And what about Emily?" she asked. "If she sent those emails, does that mean she's working with him?" John shook his head. "I don't think so," he said. "Emily, she wanted me to acknowledge her and the kids. She was angry, but she wouldn't have put you all in danger. That's not who she is." Sarah's lips curled in a bitter smile. "So you're suddenly an expert on who she is?" she said. "Spare us the defense of your mistress, John. It doesn't change the fact that she lit the match that's burning our lives down." A knock at the front door shattered the tense silence. All four of them froze, their eyes darting toward the sound. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice. "Police! Open up!" Jake was the first to move, peering cautiously through the window. Two uniformed officers stood on the porch, their faces unreadable. "It's real," he said, turning back to the others. "They're cops." Sarah walked to the door, her hand trembling as she unlocked it. "Officers," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "What's this about?" One of the officers, a tall man with a stern expression, glanced over her shoulder into the house. "We need to speak with John Harrison," he said. "It's regarding a report we received about a disturbance at St. Mary's Church last night." John stepped forward reluctantly. "That was a misunderstanding," he said quickly. The officer raised a hand to stop him. "We're going to need you to come with us," he said. "We have some questions about the incident, and there's also a matter of a recent report filed against you." Sarah's heart sank. "What report?" she asked. The officer's eyes met hers, his expression hard. "We received an anonymous tip linking Mr. Harrison to fraudulent activity in Richmond years ago. We're investigating possible connections to criminal organizations." Sarah felt her knees weaken. It was all unraveling faster than she had imagined. The past John had tried to bury wasn't just catching up, it was dragging them all down with it. As the officers led John to their squad car, Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, Emma and Jake at her side. The text message, the knock on the door, the anonymous tip. It was all connected. Whoever was pulling the strings wasn't finished with them yet. And now, without John's presence, Sarah realized they were more vulnerable than ever. The squad car's red and blue lights disappeared down the street, leaving the family in the growing darkness. "Mom," Emma said quietly, her voice shaking, "what do we do now?" Sarah took a deep breath, trying to summon a strength she wasn't sure she had. "We don't wait," she said. "We find out who's behind this before they come for us." The house fell into silence again, but outside a figure watched from the shadows, their silhouette barely visible in the dim streetlight. The nightmare wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The hours after John's arrest crawled by in oppressive silence. Sarah, Emma, and Jake huddled together in the living room, the weight of their uncertainty pressing down on them. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of the wind outside, felt amplified, charged with menace. Sarah paced the room, her mind racing. She couldn't wait for the police to fix this. The danger was too immediate. They needed answers, and they needed them now. Emma broke the silence, her voice brittle. "We should call Emily. If she sent those emails, she might know who's behind this." Sarah hesitated. The thought of reaching out to the woman who had upended their lives made her stomach churn, but Emma was right. Emily was their only lead. With trembling hands, Sarah picked up her phone and dialed the number she had reluctantly saved after the confrontation at the retirement ceremony. The phone rang twice before Emily's voice answered, wary but sharp. "Sarah, what do you want?" "We don't have time for this," Sarah snapped. "Who did you send John's emails to? Who's threatening us?" Emily hesitated, her voice softening slightly. "I don't know who they are," she admitted. "I thought they were journalists. They reached out to me after I hinted online about John's other family. They said they wanted to expose corruption, but they wanted more than just the truth. They wanted leverage." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Leverage? For what?" "I don't know," Emily replied, her voice trembling. "They didn't tell me. But Sarah, if they're after you now—" "I'm sorry. I didn't know it would go this far." The line went dead, leaving Sarah clutching the phone, her mind spinning. Leverage. Whoever these people were, they weren't interested in justice. They wanted power, control, and they wouldn't stop until they got it. Before Sarah could speak, Jake's voice cut through the tension. "Mom, look." He pointed to the living room window. Outside, under the pale glow of a street lamp, a figure stood motionless. Their face was obscured by a hood, but their presence was unmistakably deliberate. They weren't hiding. They were watching. Panic surged through Sarah. "Get upstairs now," she ordered. Emma and Jake didn't argue, sprinting up the stairs as Sarah grabbed her phone and dialed 911. "There's someone outside my house," she said, her voice shaking. "I think we're in danger." The operator assured her that officers were on their way, but the minutes felt like hours. Sarah locked the doors and windows, her heart pounding as she watched the figure from behind the curtains. They didn't move, didn't flinch, even as the faint wail of sirens approached. When the police arrived, the figure was gone. The officers searched the area, finding no trace of the intruder, but the tension in Sarah's chest didn't ease. Whoever it was, they had been deliberate. They wanted her to know they were there, and that they could come back any time. Upstairs, Sarah found Emma and Jake sitting on the bed, their faces pale. "They're not going to stop," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "Whoever this is, they're not going to stop." Sarah sat beside her daughter, wrapping an arm around her. "We'll figure it out," she said, though the words felt hollow. She didn't know how to protect them, didn't know how to stop whatever force was closing in on their family. Just then, her phone buzzed. A new message appeared on the screen, this time with a photo attached. Her blood froze as she opened it. The photo showed John sitting in a cold, sterile interrogation room at the police station. The message read, "You're next." Sarah's breath caught and her vision blurred as she stared at the screen. The implications were clear. Whoever had sent this wasn't just watching them. They were inside the system, closer than she had feared. The family's nightmare wasn't ending. It was escalating. "We need to go," Sarah said firmly, her voice breaking through the haze of fear. "Pack a bag. We're leaving tonight." "Where will we go?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. "Somewhere they can't find us," Sarah replied. She didn't have a plan, only a desperate instinct to run, to keep her children safe. But as she glanced out the window one last time, she knew it wouldn't be enough. The truth was a predator, and no matter how far they ran, it would hunt them down. As they piled into the car, the darkness swallowed the house behind them. The road stretched ahead, unknown and uncertain. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, her resolve hardening. If they couldn't escape, she would fight. She had lost trust, security, and the life she had built, but she wouldn't lose her children. Not to John's lies, and not to the shadows chasing them. The past had come for them, and now Sarah would do whatever it took to ensure the future wasn't stolen too.